Well, my name is Jen, and I am originally from a smallish town in western Wisconsin, but I currently live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I grew up in a family that absolutely loves sports, so I ended up going to college for sports. When my first job outside of college was with the Chicago Cubs, it was kind of a pinch me moment. I really love to read and write. I have for as long as I can remember. And writing has really become like a big part of my healing process, is like just kind of process everything I've gone through with cancer. I always kind of say that it was actually this random general education class that I took when I was in college that may have ended up saving my life. As part of our general education requirements, when I was in college, we had to choose a physical education class, and I ended up just taking a general health class. And as part of that curriculum, we were each assigned to do a research project and report on a different illness or disease. And mine ended up being skin cancer. And so, something that I knew nothing about, I learned the different types of skin cancer and the warning signs. And what really stuck with me were the ABCDEs of melanoma. And so that really came full circle then. A few years later, I was living in Chicago. I was working for the Cubs, and it was late 2014. And just at some point, I had started to notice that there was a mole on my right shoulder that just didn't sit right with me. I didn't know how long it had been there. I knew it hadn't always been there. Otherwise, I wouldn't all of a sudden be noticing it. But I really can't trace back to when it first appeared. The first picture I remember seeing it in was around July of that year when I went back later and looked. But it was really, as far as the ABCDEs, it was the color that really stood out. And then it was asymmetrical. And then the D or diameter. So it was like kind of a dark chocolatey brown on one half and even darker brown on the other half. And then right in the middle, there was a black dot. So the color was very unique. If you drew a line down the center, it didn't match. And then it was larger than the size of a pencil eraser, which are really three of the five things that you look for when it comes to melanoma. So as I said, that was late 2014. I went home for the holidays and I showed it to my mom. And of course, she was trying to be reassuring. And she's like, I'm sure it's nothing, but you should definitely make an appointment with a dermatologist. If nothing else, you'll get peace of mind. So somehow, when I got back to Chicago, I actually got an appointment very fast. Maybe it was because of the holidays, because these days, the dermatology wait is probably like 6 months to get in and see somebody. But I was able to get in within like a week. I went in and met with the dermatologist, and he looked at the mole and he put his hand on my shoulder and just said, thank you for coming in and showing me this. And my heart just kind of sunk. Like his reaction was very, very like sobering. It just, but in a way, I think it sort of helped to prepare me. You're never prepared to hear the words you have cancer, but I knew that it was serious, and it was a good thing I had come in when I did. And so I would tell anyone, if you see something, you have any doubts, trust your gut and make the appointment. Worst case scenario, it's nothing, and that's what you would hope for. But so when I left the appointment that day, they did a shave biopsy and sent it down to pathology and told me I would probably hear from them middle of the following week, if I didn't hear from them by that following Friday, to give them a call. So then less than a week later, at Monday, I was at work sitting at my cubicle in our office, and I got a phone call, and I didn't recognize the number. And so I let it go to voicemail. And then I saw that it was from my doctor, and I was not expecting to hear from them that soon. So I excused myself to the hallway to give them a call back. And it was also end of day, like 4:30 in the afternoon. So nurses and doctors were probably getting ready to leave, finishing up their last appointment. So she put me on hold, and she came back and she goes, Jennifer, they want to speak to you right away. I'm going to put you through to the doctor. And it was just another one of those moments where like my heart just sank. And I remember so vividly, like I was outside the elevator bank, like one of my coworkers was coming off the elevator, and I smiled at him, like everything was fine. And inside I'm just like, this is going to change everything. And so the doctor came back on, and he's like, I'm sorry to tell you this, it's cancer. And I remember nothing else from the phone call after that. Called my mom, and it was calling her and having to say those words out loud that really made it real for the first time. And that was probably one of the hardest things, is going through that alone. In the coming days, like, I made an appointment on that phone call to have a consultation with an oncologist that Wednesday. And so, of course, my family being 5 hours by car away, and knowing that they would want to be coming down for like the surgery and treatment and all of that. The oncologist was great. We called my mom in on speakerphone. She was able to be on speakerphone through the entire conversation, and which was really helpful because I just found out that I had cancer. So my mind is spinning. The questions I have are definitely not the questions she has. And the odds of me remembering anything, I definitely didn't take notes. We kind of were giggling at my mom and all the questions she would ask. But in the end, I was really grateful because those were things that, of course, as we got closer to my surgery, I would wonder about. She had the answers and it hadn't occurred to me. So based on the shave biopsy that they had done, their initial estimate of staging was that I was stage 1B, but the only way to be sure of that was to also do a sentinel node biopsy and make sure that the cancer hadn't spread to my lymph node. So a sentinel node biopsy is it's a procedure where typically it's done the day of your surgery. So you go in a little bit earlier before your operation, and what they do is they will inject like a dye into the area of where your cancer is. And so then you have to sit and wait for that dye to travel through your bloodstream. So they're able to see if the cancer had spread, what is the most likely route that it would go. It's very painful. The dye is the closest thing I can compare it to is a lidocaine injection, but it's that times like 50. It almost like burns. You can feel it traveling through. And then what happens is they end up, after it's had time to travel, they take a bunch of photos. So you have to stay really still. It's about a 15 to 20-minute process. Well, they bring you in, you're like split into a tube very similar to like an MRI, and they scan and take pictures. And then any of the lymph nodes that light up, those are the ones that they end up removing during surgery. And so for me, I actually had lymph nodes in 2 different areas that lit up. So I had to have 2 removed from under my right arm and 1 removed from the right side of my neck. I had never had surgery before this. Luckily, after they gave me the anesthesia, my mom and my sister were able to walk beside my bed while they started wheeling me down to the OR. So the last thing I remember is my sister being on one side and my mom being on the other. I was out cold before I even got to the operating room. And so then the next thing I remember, I believe the surgery took about 2.5 to 3 hours. And the next thing I remember is waking up in the operating room and I was incredibly nauseous. So that's a common side effect of anesthesia. But because I hadn't had surgery before, we didn't know that I was going to have that. And so I was in the recovery room for a pretty long time because I wasn't able to leave until I was able to at least keep crackers and some water down. Through an IV, they were able to give me anti-nausea meds, but it was at least half an hour before I could even sit up without feeling nauseous. So I believe we left around 4:30. So in all, from the time I got there at 8 a.m. until the time I left, it was 8 to 4:30. So about, what is that, 9.5 hours? So after the surgery, recovery time, I had to be off of work for at least a week and a half. And then I was going to be able to return to half days with sort of restricted mobility. Because I lived in Chicago and I didn't have a car, my parents, or my mom and my sister, were able to stay through the weekend, and they really helped me get set up with groceries, get things close by me in my apartment, and set me up as best as I could. But I ended up having not a reaction to Vicodin, but I'd never had it before. And the Vicodin ended up making me very nauseous as well. So there were days when I'd be like laying on my side trying to eat something before taking the Vicodin just to even be able to manage it, because it made me so sick to my stomach. So the doctor prescribed a new medication that would help with the pain, but would hopefully not have the same side effects. And we were in the middle of a snowstorm. I didn't have a car. A friend of mine had to dig their car out of a snowbank to go get it for me. And I think that was the first time that I really realized that if I had to continue doing this on my own, I didn't think it was probably realistic to do so far away from my family with that extra support. And it just happened that my ongoing treatment, it took about a week and a half to get the results from my surgery pathology. My lymph nodes were both confirmed, or all three were confirmed clear, that there had been no spread. So that confirmed a stage 1B diagnosis. And so then the plan at that time was skin checks every 3 months for 5 years to be reassessed in 3 years, depending on if we found further spots, if I had other recurrences, anything like that. And my very next skin check, it just happened to be the day before my lease was up on my apartment. Knowing that my skin check was the day before my lease was up just left this whole like feeling of my life being really uncertain. And obviously a lot of that was probably cancer too. But at the time, I really hadn't even processed the actual diagnosis. Everything happened so fast from the time of my appointment with the dermatologist, where they did a shape biopsy, until the surgery where they actually removed the melanoma, was less than 3 weeks. And so everything happened incredibly fast. And I remember after the surgery, when we got the pathology that everything was clear, I was like, that was it. And there was a lot of guilt surrounding that, because so many people have more challenging cancer diagnosis and go through a lot more treatment. And I, of course, had no idea what was to come, but I didn't really process it because everything happened so fast. And I think my immediate reaction was just to put it behind me. But then when I had that skin check, I was like, well, what if this comes back? I can't do this on my own. It's really hard. I had amazing friends in Chicago, but I had not even been there quite 2 years. So I didn't have the same strength of relationships that I had back home. But I had my foot in the door at an incredible organization. I was halfway through getting my master's degree in sports management at that point. So I felt like I was having to choose between like two futures, really. And ultimately I did end up deciding to go home, but that was really hard too, because that meant I wasn't going to have a job. I hadn't lived at home for years. And it felt like a huge step backwards. And going from a big city like to Chicago to my pretty small hometown, where I wasn't close with a lot of my classmates from high school, didn't feel like I had a lot there. It was a really difficult transition. So when I was back home, I really at first leaned into like running, taking care of myself, getting outside. A lot of anxieties crept in, just even that you wouldn't think about. So I had melanoma, which is skin cancer. So I want to go for a run. Typically, I was a middle of the day runner. I'm not going to run outside in the middle of the day, because now, to a degree, I'm like afraid of the sun. Like, I can't have this cancer come back. I don't want to go through this. And so I've developed now a healthy relationship with the sun. But for a while, if it was between 10 and 2, I was terrified to be outside, because I was afraid that something I had done had caused this, and I didn't want to cause it to happen again. I also wasn't working, so I had a lot of free time. I felt somewhat worthless because I wasn't doing any. I mean, I was actually finishing my master's at that time, but I placed so much worth in this career that I was working towards, that all of a sudden feeling stagnant was really difficult. I was applying for a ton of jobs up in St. Paul, Minneapolis, which is a pretty big sports community as well, and just wasn't hearing a lot back. And so that really took a hit on my self-esteem also. All of my friends were either in the Twin Cities, which is an hour car ride away, or back in Chicago, which was a 5.5 hour car ride away. So my parents were essentially my entire social life. And I went to coffee one day, and it was like a really eye-opening moment After I left the coffee shop, I was sitting at the stoplight and I was just waiting for it to turn green so that I could go. And I just remember thinking, like, I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to be alive anymore. I felt like such a huge burden to my parents at this point. I had had some more skin checks and they all came back with needing more biopsies. Luckily, none of them were, of course, melanoma at that point, but they were coming back atypical. And I just couldn't see a future that didn't involve my family having to take care of me and me like being terrified of cancer and having more biopsies and more surgeries. I felt hopeless, like there was no way out. I had struggled with depression in the past. And so obviously, when I had that thought cross through my mind, I immediately was aware of it and caught it and was like, this is not okay. And I don't want to feel this way. And because of my history with depression, I was able to talk to my mom about it. We have a pretty open relationship about that stuff. And I had been able to go to her for support when it had happened before. So I started seeing a therapist close to my hometown, and it was helpful. At the time, she wasn't really maybe the right fit for me, but there weren't a ton of options, and so it was helping. My sister ended up the company that she worked for needed some help, and so I was able to start working there just part-time. She of course knew that it was temporary, but for me it at least gave me a feeling of doing something worthwhile. I was making money. If I wanted to go visit my friends in the cities, I could pay for my own gas. It gave me a little bit more of that like sense of independence back. And a few months later, I ended up getting a job offer for an internship at Target Field with the Minnesota Twins. And so obviously with mental health and depression, having good things happen doesn't fix it. It doesn't cure it. I still go to therapy at least once a month, sometimes more often, just really depending on what's happening with my health and what stage we're at with like skin checks and biopsies and things like that. But I think it's really just choosing every single day to do the smallest thing that you can do and go from there. Some days, if you can get up and you take a shower and you brush your teeth and that's all you can do, you did it. And it's just every day, like keep going and finding things. For me, it's really been finding things that bring me purpose. And I think that cancer has really changed my perspective on that. It's changed how I see like career and how I spend my time and things like that. But finding what really drives you to want to get out of bed in the morning and doing the smallest thing every day that you can towards that. And eventually you find yourself being able to do more and more. Actually, there was a pretty significant time frame between my first diagnosis in January 2015 and my second diagnosis in January of 2020, which hearing 2020, people probably cringe. But in January of 2020, I celebrated 5 years cancer free. I had a big celebration with friends and family. And it felt like such a huge accomplishment. And I really needed to celebrate it because one thing that's very unique about melanoma is even though your melanoma maybe hasn't come back, it doesn't mean that you're not having the biopsies and you're not having the surgeries. About a year later, while we are still very much in the effects of the pandemic, in March of 2021, I received my second melanoma diagnosis. And because of my skin checks, which at that point we were up to 6 month skin checks because I've been doing pretty well. But then we found a stage 0. And so it's they still do what's called a WLE or wide local excision, which is a surgery. The difference between with a stage 0, I'm actually awake for it instead of under anesthesia because they don't have to go in, excuse me, they don't have to go in as deep or as wide. They don't have to take quite as much skin. So you're actually awake for the entire thing. And then that was the first of a very tough year for me. So I actually had my third diagnosis a few months later in October of 2021. That one ended up being another stage 1B. So I did again have to go under anesthesia with that one because I had had a stage 1 or stage 0 melanoma in that area, as well as two severely atypical moles removed. I had a lot of scar tissue, and they can't use scar tissue to help close up the wound. And so a plastic surgeon had to come in again. And I ended up having almost an entire like external shoulder reconstruction where they had to like take the skin and actually like shift everything in order to close it and take more skin than they normally would because they were cutting out some of that scar tissue. So I actually have one scar that used to go up and down that actually now goes horizontally, which is like the biggest thing that I can see now that really shows like how much they had to do at that time. And then a few months later, again, I ended up having my fourth melanoma diagnosis, which was another stage 0 melanoma. So in 11 months, I had 3 recurrences. It was, I was very much in survival mode, not as much after the first one because it was a stage 0. So it felt like, okay, our plan is working. Obviously, this isn't ideal. I don't want more melanomas, but we caught it very early. A stage 0, it's cancer, but it's like borderline precancerous. So it's basically where it's like right on the edge of being a severely atypical mole and a melanoma. And so it felt like a setback, but wasn't as devastating as getting that next one in October. And actually, I just started my new job as the director of marketing in July of 2021. And so then in October, just a few months later, having to tell them my cancer's back, I'm going to need some time off. I'm facing a lot of uncertainty. This is my second one now in like 6 months. That was a really difficult conversation to have. They were incredibly supportive. They still are. But I continued to go to therapy, but I feel like I just met with my therapist and essentially cried on every visit. And we talked a lot about how to live in those small moments between, because I couldn't see a future past manic skin check because it was starting to feel like, is this really going to be the rest of my life? Like skin check melanoma, skin check melanoma. And so it wasn't until the first skin check after that stage 0, the final stage 0 or most recent one, that I was able to let out a little bit of a breath. Everything came back benign in that one. And so we didn't have to do any further excisions. And since then, I've actually had 2 skin checks where we didn't do any biopsies. And in February, actually on Valentine's Day of this year, I celebrated 1 year cancer free again. And I had a skin check the week before that anniversary date. But in addition to my 3-month skin checks, which I'm currently still on, we plan to review next year, a year from now. If everything still goes really good and I'm not having more biopsies, we'll probably go up to 3 months. The goal is to hit annual skin checks. I very much plan my therapy around those skin checks. That really helps. So when I know I have a skin check, I will schedule a therapy appointment the same week. Or if the skin check's at the beginning of the week, my therapy appointment will be at the end of the week. And so it's so helpful just to know that I have this person to talk to and sort of help process all of those feelings. And no matter what happens, that I have that extra support system behind me. I find that a majority of my like scanxiety or anxiety comes leading up to the skin check. And then really no matter how many biopsies they do, there's still that sense of relief because that's the part that unfortunately I've become most comfortable with. So they can do 4 biopsies, and I've had 4 biopsies in one visit before, but I'm like, okay, so now from here, I know what happens. They'll either come back moderately atypical and we'll do this, or it'll be like severely atypical and we'll do this. So I know how to handle what happens after. I don't know how to handle the uncertainty. So going into the skin check is actually harder than waiting for the result. That's been something that I've really been working through in the last year and a half, is figuring out how to live for the future and not for the next melanoma. One thing that I didn't know until after I was diagnosed is that you can get melanoma in your eyes even. And so even my annual eye exams are extra important. They do the 3D imaging now instead of dilating my eyes at every appointment. So even my eye exams have changed. And then also wearing a hat anytime that you're outside, because even if you put sunscreen on your scalp, it just, the sun is beating down on the top of your head and then just the tops of your ears, the back of your neck. So wearing a hat, especially a wide brimmed hat, is so important if you're going to be outside. If you can, avoid peak sunlight hours. Typically that's between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. when the sun is hottest. I've learned a lot about the UV index, which it ranges from 0 to about like 12. You'll very rarely see it get that high, but at a 0, it's very safe. It's usually like right away in the morning or at dusk where the UV intensity isn't as high. And then the higher it gets, the more often you have to apply sunscreen, the more that you should seek shade, wearing those extra layers of like UPF clothing, sunglasses, hats, and stuff like that. 2 blistering sunburns before the age of 18 can increase your risk of skin cancer by over 50%. I know tanning beds, especially, a lot of people think if they use tanning beds, it's safer, and it's actually not, because tanning beds, there's UVA rays and UVB rays, and tanning beds have the type of UV rays that are less likely to make you burn, but it's actually the type that's more likely to give you skin cancer. I think there's really 2 pieces of information that I would give to somebody going through diagnosis. The first one, and I hear it a lot from others who have experienced cancer as well, but really believe yourself and advocate for yourself. So if a doctor tells you that you're wrong, never be afraid of getting a second opinion. Nobody knows your body better than you do. And if something doesn't feel right, maybe it's not. Have a care team that you trust. That is so important. So if you have any hesitations about your doctor, seek out a second one. And like I said before, the worst thing that happens is it's nothing, but you would never want to not do it. And then it ends up changing the course of your treatment, or you end up missing something or catching something later when it could really change the outcomes. And then the other thing is, it's so common to feel lost after a cancer diagnosis. We go through so much that it really changes you. It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you see your career, time with your family, time in general, and really try to change that perspective of I'm lost and I don't know who I am anymore, into this idea that you get to find out who you are now and really like have fun exploring and trying new things and seeing what you love now. Like you're getting to get to know yourself all over again. And for me personally, I felt like a huge lack of control, loss of control after my diagnosis. And something I never in a million years would have dreamed of doing was like speaking to lawmakers and Congress. And advocacy work has given me so much purpose. And that's not going to be the same for everybody, but that's something I never even would have considered before my diagnosis. And I get like so much joy and purpose out of it. And being able to take that like frustration and lack of control and channel that into something that's really creating change for others facing similar experiences.